Stigma is the feeling you get as a member of a group that society does not value.
People who have a mental illness are excluded and treated unfairly, and this is because people are afraid of mental illness.
Stigma produces a kind of isolation that grows from fear.
There's public stigma. What are the viewpoints of the general populace about people with mental illness? There's institutional stigma. What about laws that prevent people from having their full rights or lack of access to health care? There's internalized or self-stigma. How do I feel about myself if I'm in one of these groups that's downgraded? There's courtesy or family stigma. What if I'm associated with someone who's stigmatized? Maybe my whole family is.
And it's fundamentally unjust, and in most countries against the law because of the discrimination that often results.
So in many ways, the stigma can be as disabling as the illness itself.
Stigma is a degrading attribute that it's hard to shake, but we need to, because people with mental illness are people, not defined by their mental illnesses, and we can overcome stigma.
Good morning. I'm Nancy Glazer, Chair of the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors. On behalf of the board, we welcome you to today's community conversation, Stigma, Lead the Change, sponsored in partnership with Bring Change to Mind, the national organization founded by Glenn Close and her sister Jessie, working on the front lines to change the conversation around mental illness through rigorous scientifically researched programs and public service announcements. Together, we share a commitment to ending stigma and discrimination, which can lead to negative feelings of isolation and erect barriers to effective treatment. We truly thank you for your time, interest, and passion. I'd like to acknowledge in attendance today, and please stand when I say your name, from Bring Change to Mind, Pamela Harrington, CEO, Leanne Loughran, High School Program Director, and Leslie Goldberg, Board Member. From UCLA, we have representative members from our Resnick board. Thank you all for biographical information on this morning's speakers, please reference your program, which is in the blue bag. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the faculty advisor of the Resnick board, the medical director of the UCLA Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital, and today's moderator, Dr. Thomas Strauss. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Nancy. We are fortunate to be at a university that values what we do. As some of you know, the psychiatric bed is sort of an endangered species in California and across the country, and we're very proud to operate a preeminent hospital just across the street, which runs under a separate license and has 74 beds and is full all the time and isn't nearly enough to meet the need for acute psychiatric care in our community. But that's not what we're here to talk about this morning. You are in for an extraordinary treat today. I can tell you because we spent some time last evening with our visiting faculty, and I think this is going to be just an incredible couple hours. So here's the drill. This is actually the third Community Conversations event. We think we have worked out a format that works well for our community participants. We're going to have 3 talks. They're sort of TED Talk-like. They're brief. We ask our faculty to say tell the audience everything you know that you've learned in your career in 15 minutes. Actually, you know, for academics, that's really a big challenge. But they succeed. And we have an incredible faculty this morning. The other very important point is we really know that the best part of this is the Q&A that follows. So after each of the 3 talks, we're going to have the faculty will sit right here in chairs, and I will moderate a Q&A session. And we hope that you'll be writing questions on the 3x5 cards that are in your packets. sort of towards the end of each speaker. If you're provoked or if you have a question that comes to mind, please write it down, and we'll be collecting cards after each speaker, and then I will collate them and present, and we'll review not all but many of them as we go through the Q&A at the end. Okay, so that's the drill. You know where the bathrooms are, you know where the coffee is, and we're going to get started. Our first speaker is my dear friend and colleague and somebody who's taught me a tremendous amount over the nearly 30 years we've worked together, Ken Wells. Ken is the David Weil Endowed Professor of Psychiatry and here at UCLA, and as somebody said yesterday, perhaps the preeminent health services researcher in community-based models for evaluating and treating depression in the entire universe. That was said by one of our visiting colleagues who I think was not being excessive. That was an honest appraisal. I'm sure Ken will not accept it because he's very modest. But he's going to talk about engaging communities in resilience over depression, some community partnered work he has done. His partner, Felica Jones, unfortunately is ill and not able to be here, so Ken's going to be going solo. Ken?
Thank you. Good morning. This is really an important topic. We know that the work that we do has this coloring over it from the attitudes that people have around mental health and seeking mental health care. Over the last 15 years or so, Healthy African American Families, Felica is the program director there, and our center and others have been working together to figure out how do you take the promise of best practices in mental health, using depression as an example, and really build both the evidence for it and the engagement strategies in under-resourced communities, especially communities of color. The year I was born, actually, this definition of mental health was issued by the World Health Organization. Mental health is not just the absence of mental disorder, but a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. So maybe that held a sway over my life as I grew up, given that it came out the year I was born. And it's really not just about, it's about the whole person, is basically what this says, which I think we all know, and that's why we're here. But it's often not how we're trained, either as clinicians or if we're patients going through the system. Somehow it becomes about something much narrower. So to kind of figure out how this perspective would be applied, I apprenticed myself for a number of years to a model of community engagement. This is Loretta Jones, the mother of Felica Jones, who could not be here today. Loretta is speaking on my behalf in Delaware today. So this model really honors transparency, being straightforward with what's going on, respect for persons, equal power sharing of everyone at the table, co-leadership, and two-way knowledge exchange. I know this, a community member may know that. We respect each other, we listen, and then work together with those perspectives put together. This is another key aspect of the model, is kind of who's in charge. So in the center, those partners, let's think of that as the group that would normally be thought of as in charge. It's being informed by what we call resident experts, which would be, it might be a researcher, it might be a community member, and outside of that is the community at large. So really who's in charge, if you will, is the community at large. And the reporting, the responsibility, the planning is a shared process where a leadership group with drawing on expertise is reporting back and then taking that message forward to the next steps. So in applying that to mental health, the first step was a program that began in 2003 called Witness for Wellness. And Witness for Wellness, you see the principles that we talked about, fueling the bus going up the hill towards wellness. The reason it's a bus is people get on and off the bus as they need to. They're still part of the family, but we all have our needs, like Felica couldn't be here today. And at the bottom on the road is what the community considered research to be. Sharing information and resources, looking and listening carefully, recording it, and moving forward. Really, again, this is that translation of more technical concepts into understandable ideas. And then on the road to wellness, talking wellness, you see demystifying depression or addressing stigma, building the community strength, community outreach and quality services, building, and supporting. So for about 4 years, there were extensive efforts, especially here in South Los Angeles, Hollywood, and downtown, to figure out, directly working with large community stakeholder groups, how to do that work. The community really wanted to address stigma through art. So we, among other things, had poetry reading sessions in South Los Angeles, and then audience responses and discussions. This is an example.
And this one is called Depression. Hissing silence curls in my brain, squeezes my eyes open. Nights are not friendly. They are too long. Days are no better. The big sky has shrunk around my head, pushed the walls in. I am too tired to resist. The musty visitor slips under my door. My incense burns, no match. He moves relentlessly through the loose weave of my dream catcher and catches me before I sleep.
This was an audience response to that poem.
What I think I hear with this wellness group is that you guys are going to start giving us the vocabulary. That you're going to start making it okay to have feelings. Okay not to know all the answers. Okay not to do all the things that we do to block ourselves from what we feel. And that I applaud. Thank you.
So, as the community was addressing stigma, improving the ability to talk about issues, the Building Quality Committee was reviewing components of what is called collaborative care for depression. You can see there's lots of components: therapy, medication management, care management team, and figuring out, okay, with this perspective, how do we engineer doing this as a community? And as that dialogue was going on, Katrina destroyed much of New Orleans, and we were asked to help bring that model by the American Red Cross into the mental health recovery effort. What we had to do, because many of the clinics were destroyed, was work with the local ministers and the neighborhood associations and the caseworkers and train up people, as is commonly done in the international community, not so much in the United States, to do the work that was needed to address trauma, depression, and other things. And this is an example of a gentleman who had become depressed, withdrawn, was still going to work, stopped playing his guitar, was visited by one of our neighborhood associations, agreed to have some discussion, made an agreement that he would get off the bus one stop early and walk an extra block, called the caseworker and said, I feel a little better. Next time I'll try 2 blocks. He got off, ran into someone he hadn't seen since high school. They had coffee, they went to the movie. And then the way I found out about that is the caseworker, shaking his hand, came to a training and said, I failed. I said, what do you mean? I didn't get him to see a doctor. Well, how's he doing? He's doing great. So We then brought that model back, and that became community partners in care. So taking together the talking about wellness, the building wellness, all of the use of the community from the faith-based organization to the barbershop to the clinic to work together. And this shows you all of these different parts in the community. What we did is we compared getting technical resources for each agency tailored to them, or working with the community as a whole collaboratively to figure out how do we take these tools and become a community and tailor it to our culture and so forth. And agencies were randomized, which is why the coin is there. And let's see if we can show this.
Depression is real
and is the leading cause of disability in adults.
It affects a person's productivity, their family life, and their communities.
It affects how you work,
how you love,
and how you live. But there is hope.
With education and quality care,
depression is treatable.
But there are barriers to getting high quality care,
especially in minority and under-resourced communities.
Because depression has a stigma.
People who have it and are treated think that others will see them as crazy.
And this makes it difficult to seek help.
So, how do we break stigma?
And bring quality care to the community.
By working with the organizations in these communities who have already earned the trust of depressed clients.
And that's just what we did. Together, we became community partners in care, CPIC.
So, how did we do it?
By creating training and programs together.
To think of depression as a community problem.
Rather than a primary care problem.
Guiding over 500 providers through more than 100 conferences and trainings.
People really grew together.
And the results were amazing.
Mental well-being and physical activities in these communities improve.
Visits to faith-based settings increase.
The risk factors and numbers in homelessness decrease.
Depression is treatable.
And the stigma can be overcome.
We're building a community from the community.
CPIC.
Join us in beating depression.
So that's a brief summary of, thanks. It's a brief summary of what we found in our research. It was a randomized trial, and actually this fall we'll be actually publishing our 3-year outcomes. So we've been following people over 3 years. And there was about a 50% reduction in hospitalization in the study, as well as improvements in homelessness and behavioral health and physical health. Okay. Anyway, and a really nice thing is the partnership of about 120 academic and community members and our New Orleans partners that helped us develop this model won the 2014 Association of Clinical and Translational Science Team Science Award. It's actually the first time that an applied study has won that award, and the 2015 Campus Community Partnerships for Health Award. And the model that Loretta and her group developed really emphasizes capacity building. So we had a big party with the slogan, "What I have to say today is put it on your resume." Because everyone kept coming up to me and congratulating me. I said, wait a minute, you won this award. You got the certificate. So it's really making sure people understand, and that's part of the legacy as well. This is, if Falika were here, she'd be doing this piece. She'd be asking you to take out your keys and say, what key do you have? This is my car key. I have a car. That means you've got a car. This is my house key. That means you have a home. And this key to the future is that we all have keys. Who doesn't have keys? The homeless, children, seniors. We need to remember that we are the voice for the voiceless together. It takes all of us to address stigma and build services quality. So I'm trying to be a little Falika-like at the end to represent her. Thank you.
1 in 4 of us will be affected by mental illness at some point in our lives. Yet nearly 2/3 of us will never seek help, especially men. We pride ourselves on courage and our ability to never show weakness. But mental health touches us all. We are athletes, actors, and musicians. We are friends, husbands, and fathers. It's one of us, it's one of you. It's time for men to talk about mental health. Help starts with the conversation. End the stigma. To learn more about our stories, visit bringchangetomind.org.
Thanks very much, Ken, and Felica in absentia for a great kickoff presentation. So Ken and Felica sort of represented the local talent, but when we organize these events, we search widely for true experts, and so we're delighted that through our connection to Bring Change to Mind, to present our next speaker team to you. That team is Dr. Bernice Pescosolido, who is a professor of sociology at Indiana University and a very esteemed scientist in her own right, and George Patrick Hutchins, who just finished his sophomore year at IU, hopes to go to medical school, a delightful young person who I had the pleasure of sitting next to at dinner last night. So they're going to talk with you now next, so welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Okay, I'm here, I hope, to get this, well, that didn't work very well. Okay, I'm here to get this moving in terms of talking about Bring Change to Mind's college program. And people who know me know that, okay, good. People who know me know that I'm a bit of a Pollyanna. Okay, I'm a sociologist, so that means I'm a cynical Pollyanna, but nevertheless, I'm a Pollyanna. And in 1990, I applied to the National Institute of Mental Health to do a study of college students. And the reason that I wanted to do that was because I was really frustrated with the models of trying to understand who got into care and who didn't, and who traveled other pathways that didn't end up in care, but nonetheless had better well-being at the end. And so I applied, and my grant did not get discussed. And the reason was that they said, you know, we really like this new idea of a social network model, that it's really about people talking to people is how they bounce off each other and get into care. But could you please study people who are important and who really have mental health problems? And college students are not those people. And okay, so I have to admit I caved, and I encountered in myself my first sense of stigma, spending the next 4 years studying first-timers to the two largest hospitals in Indiana, and spending 9 months of that 4 years in 2 of the acute psychiatric units in the 2 largest hospitals in Indiana. And that taught me a lot, and we learned, we were able to document that, yes, in fact, networks are really the community, and that interface between the community and the treatment system really is fueled by connectedness. And this is a theme that, you know, we've brought into trying to understand stigma. So let me tell you about, the other thing people know about me is that I'm like a junkyard dog with a new tire. So if I have an idea that I think is important, I'm not going to let go of it. And this is part of how this happened. And I want to give you an idea of how we began looking at colleges, because this was now 20 years later. Our goal really is to make college campuses safe and stigma-free. There are other groups on college campuses who are directly attached to the counseling centers, who are engaged in peer training and peer support and get people into care. But we really wanted to look at the issue of the campus writ large and the culture of care that exists there. Because I can't think of anything more cruel than having someone with mental health get rid of that self-stigma, understand that this is not who they are, but part of who they are, and then sending them into a cruel community. And so that's, as a sociologist, that's the part that I see that we could help with. And so there are really 2 parts to this, and they're very separate. The first is the college toolbox, and that's the scientific part of this project from Bring Change to Mind. This is where we have a director and a staff that helps the students do the things that they think are really important, and I'll tell you in a minute why that's so important. This is the scientific part. This is the part where we do assessments and try to see what is evidence-based. And we do that on 2 levels. One level is that every single event that we do has an assessment with it, that the students do. So it has this education component that's important in terms of them learning more about how one thinks about improving care and improving community programs. And the other part is a large study that we're doing of the campus culture at IU. The second part, which my collaborator, George, is going to talk about, is the program itself. The University Bring Change to Mind part, which is by students, for students, which he'll talk about, and really is the action component. Okay, so how did this happen? Well, this happened because Indiana University has every year in the College of Arts and Sciences a program called Themester. They find a group of faculty can propose a special theme. So we've had themes on food and the body, and I thought, well, one of the things that's really important is this notion of connectedness, you know, and thinking about networks in a complex world. And so we were awarded it for the academic year 2013-2014. And so as part of that, I asked Glenn to come out and talk about Bring Change to Mind, because this was one of the groups that was really focused on the issue of connectedness through the idea of starting the conversation, and that was a way to end stigma. And that was really a very different approach and a very, I thought, forward-thinking approach at the time. So she came out, and the students in one of my classes got very excited, and they came up with a t-shirt that they all wanted to wear when she came, and she's holding it there. And I do want to give a little warning. If you're on the prudish side, you're going to have to be a little open, because you'll see a theme to things that students think will change their minds, and they do happen to be less traditional than we might suppose. So they suggested that the t-shirt that says #StigmaSucks was a good way to go, and we ended up actually having a class that followed that. So she came, and there was a dinner that was hosted by the First Lady of IU, Lori McRobbie, and the provost was there, and the dean of the college was there, and everybody went around the room and talked about their experiences, and they weren't picked for that reason to be at the dinner, but every single one of them has been touched by mental health. And that was sort of the point. And so Lori McRobbie, the First Lady of IU, and the Provost, Lauren Robel, and Glenn were like in a corner, and they were talking, and you know, they sort of looked at me and said, well, you can do that, right, Bernice? And I said, oh, you know, I don't know. I was having this great dinner by this James Beard nominee, you know, person. And Okay, thank you. And I said, I said, sure, whatever it was, I could do it, because at that point, I was the chair of the Scientific Advisory Board of Bring Change to Mind. And what we had been doing is that my husband and I, who is a survey researcher, we had come up with a method to evaluate PSAs on both a national level, using survey research, but also a biophysiological level using different kinds of measurements. And so I thought they wanted me to evaluate something. So a little while later, I called Glenn and I said, I mean, Glenn's a little bit like the Energizer Bunny, or, the Energizer Bunny, like a tornado. And so after she had gone through IU and really impressed the campus with her mission, I called her and I said, Glenn, where's this toolbox that you want me to evaluate? And she said, evaluate it, you're going to create it. And I panicked. I panicked because I'm not an intervention researcher. But on the other hand, this idea of going back to college students was one of my junkyard, you know, dog with a new tire things that finally, in the last 15 years, and this is the good part of the story, that in the last 5 to 10 years, so that grant application was in 1990, and now this is on the radar of every college president, every provost, every chancellor now has embraced the idea that college campuses need to be open and provide learning environments in which people with mental health problems can succeed. So we had been asked by the Cold Spring Harbor Lab to do a conference, and a small conference, and you know, wasn't sure why exactly, but they, you know, if you know about Cold Spring Harbor, that's one of the places where they invented the atomic bomb. And talk about swords to plowshares, they were now calling and say, can you come and do something about stigma? And so we took this as an opportunity to jump on the idea of jump-starting the college program. And so you see Glenn there with lots of students, some of the directors of the first year of the program, some of the people who have gone on to incredible careers as Marshall Scholars, and people who are leading the institutional part of the IU effort. So that we came up there with the idea of university, bring change to mind, came up with a basic program to get started in that fall. The College Toolbox has a number of basic principles that we think are very important. And basically the idea came from a study that was done a long time ago in social science about the Vietnam War. And it was like, why did the war end? Why did Congress, and the Senate in particular, move from very pro-involvement to very anti-interventionist with regard to Vietnam? And so, you know, we've attributed a lot of reasons to it, including, you know, the student movements of that time. And it turns out that it was a very interesting indirect way, which is that that we, the people, voted out the hawks and voted in the doves. We didn't really change the minds of people in Senate and Congress, right? And so this idea of cohort replacement and focusing on the next generation coming through takes a longer look at how one changes society, but one that actually has good evidence behind it. And people have been doing work for a long time showing how hard it is to reduce stigma. That in fact, you can show with many randomized clinical trials a decreased effect, but when you go back 2 weeks, 6 months later, the effect is extinguished. So this idea of cohort replacement was very positive for us. Also, millennial generation. If you know any of the students who are millennials, they are supremely confident in their ability to change the world. Sometimes that's warranted, sometimes not so much, but that's a really good thing to have in a student body, and they were ready to take the torch and run with it, and ready to have guidance from people who had been looking at this phenomenon. We also understood that many of the things that lead to people having mental health problems comes from the prejudice and discrimination associated with other statuses that make them feel not valued. And so we know about healthcare disparities and those kinds of things. So it was focused on difference, not just mental health. The other thing is, even though we're an educational institution, we really didn't want to focus it on education because the studies had shown that education was really not the most powerful way to deal with stigma reduction, but looking at issues of inclusion and connectedness. And we all know, those of us who study stigma, that the most potent factor that affects reduction in stigma is contact. Knowing somebody, not thinking of the illness, but thinking of the person and knowing the humanity that that person has and that their illness is just part of it. Okay, so we got ready. And these are some of our initial students. They became our champions of change, or our ambassadors. And we asked students, what do you think would get other students involved in this? And they said 3 things that I was very impressed by. Well, they said they wanted money. And we can't provide money to students. That's not under policy. And the second was they wanted swag. And we learned that this is why students are very important in running this, because we were thinking of things like, oh, let's give them, you know, things for their desk and other things. And they came in and said, no, we want fanny packs. And we were like, fanny packs, you know, and tank tops, and the 70s was back. So the first thing that you learn, and I think Ken has learned this in the community, if you want to change a community, if you want to help a community change, better said, then you have to get it from that community, okay? And the final thing they wanted was education. So we had the scientific survey, and one of the things you can see there is that there are a substantial number of individuals who are come to IU with really feeling very stressed out, even though they're very excited. And that the levels from our national stigma studies that are housed at IU, that these levels are much lower than levels in the community. And so this idea of freezing these, we don't have to change as much as try to eliminate the aging effect, the stigmatizing effect of age. As people get older, they become more negative toward people with mental illness. And finally, before I turn it over to George, they wanted educational efforts. They wanted credits. And we thought that that was really a wonderful thing that students wanted. And the first thing that they wanted was they wanted to know about school shootings and were they at risk at college. And so we were able to talk about that and the role of mental illness, which is what gets publicized all the time, but in fact has a very small role in that. And then 2 courses that we've developed, a specialized course, and again, with the title Stigma Sucks, and the second, which is called Medicine in America, which is more general, but has a very large component having to do with mental health and embeds the campaign competition that George is going to tell you about. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over.
All right, thank you guys for coming out, listening to our presentations today, and I'm excited to, Dr. Pescosolido mentioned, tell you a little bit about the club specifics of You Bring Change to Mind. Then after that, I kind of want to take you through a rough outline of what our year looks like in terms of events and programming, and then I'll wrap that up by talking about how this really fits into the larger College Toolbox project and where our goals and visions align with that. So something I really want to emphasize about this is the by students, for students aspect, and that all of our event programming, our assessments, our budgeting, all those things are done by our student volunteers, students from other public health related classes, and our leadership team. And we really want to emphasize that so that way we can engage the entire campus. As Dr. Pescosolido says, those inside and outside the choir. So not just interested in stigma or mental health research, but our fine arts students, our students in our media school, our Jacob School of Music students, to really create that cohesive network of individuals and students that are geared towards stigma reduction. And the way we try to do that is through partnering with different classes and schools and saying, okay, these things that we're offering, the programming that we're doing, is there a way this fits into your curriculum? Is there an assignment or a class you can offer this in that can sort of incentivize students to participate? We do that also with our academic competition, our campaign competition, where students can put together a team and present an idea to a panel of judges. That idea is then put into effect the following year. And lastly, the rationale behind all of our events is this idea of bait and flip. So we bring them in with something that's fun or exciting. So a sporting event, or there's food, there's games, prizes, activities, and then we weave in educational components so that way they can really learn about our goals and learn about the best ways to reduce stigma. So that's our really broad purpose there. Moving more towards our leadership, we have 4 main student leaders, a president who's responsible for our budgeting, being the liaison between our program advisor and our faculty advisor, and really doing most of the large networking. We also have an outreach director who's our main communicator between other campus organizations, seeing where we're doing something novel and where we can support that organization in their cause. We have an events director who's the main driving force behind all of the logistics and ensuring that the day of details are taken care of. And then we have a membership director that does some member-only events because we think it's important to build that bond within our core You Bring Change to Mind group to bring those that are outside the choir into the choir. And also tracking membership requirements. We're going to institute those, what's an active member, what's an associate member, and what are the benefits that go along with that. So moving outside of our leadership and our structure and everything, I'll take you through the year, like I said. That really starts with our Welcome Week. It's an opportunity when students move into their housing assignments on campus. There's no classes, so it's a chance to get adjusted to the university before the madness really begins. And with that, we partner with some existing involvement fairs, some existing health fairs on campus. That's just an opportunity for us to talk about the importance of the organization, try to spread the word, advertise, and get people to participate. And that's just some of the images we have up here. So to the far left and at the bottom center of the screen, we did an event where we passed out popsicles. It was really hot outside, and we passed out some removal or some water tattoos that said, "Stigma can suck my popsicle," which, again, the kind of non-traditional names that we come up with. And that was actually one of the runners-up in our campaign competition that year. And then just some other images with students interacting with our tables, our displays, some life-size cutout of Miss Close, and then some of our tank tops here. So moving outside of Welcome Week into the semester and throughout the year, we really try to put on one large event a semester and then do some supplemental other programming or some partner programming throughout the rest of that semester. And get ready, because some of these names, again, like you said, non-traditional. So I'll start with the event that we put on this past fall. In the upper left-hand corner here, it was called our Bring in the Booty Scavenger Hunt. It was an opportunity for students to, there were mental health related clues, and you got a map. You'd read the clue, it would lead you to a location on campus. You would go there and complete an activity. So the one shown in this picture up here, there's a pirate on the wall, and it had a heart full of stigma, and they had to be blindfolded, folded, and spun around. They walked up and removed the stigma heart and placed a new lime green stigma-free heart on there. And it was also around Halloween, so there was the opportunity to dress up, win Best Dressed Costume, which you can see to the far left, your right. And then with that, so that was the fall, and then our spring event, which is the second year we've done it, was called Kick Stigma in the Balls, the kickball tournament, where, yeah, I know, kind of witty, creative names here. It was an opportunity for students, 6 to 8 students, to get a team together, play kickball, but in between select innings, there was an opportunity to get additional points by answering some trivia questions related to stigma and other topics of the sort. And then outside of those large events, like I said, we do some partner events. So we partner with our IU Cinema. We got to see some movies related to, again, mental health topics. So we saw Touched by Fire by Paul Dalio and I Smile Back by Adam Salke. And I know Paul Dalio came, and there was a chance to do a Q&A with him. So it was a good interactive event, students getting to ask the questions here. And we partnered with the lacrosse team. Our former director, who's now graduated, was a lacrosse player. So we did a Stick It to Stigma event where they wore lime green jerseys, and we did some tabling out there, just again to talk about the organization and its importance. So I talked about the ideas, but where our ideas really come from, and it's this campaign competition that we've been discussing. So like I said, students put together a team and present an idea to a panel of judges. Those judges then decide on a winner or multiple winners, and the following year that idea is put into play. So I really touched on years 2 and years 3, but I'll go back to year 1, which was a bus rap campaign. The idea behind that was don't be a Richard. Originally, it was not that. It was a little too non-traditional for the provost, so we had to change it so we could get a bus rap. And we did, but I'm sure you still get what we're going for there. And then with year 4, these ideas have actually not been put into play yet, but Rip Off Stigma, which would really take the originators of this idea to explain it to you, but it's based on a Korean game show where the whole objective is to rip off someone's name tag from their back, and that's how you score points and advance in the game. And then we have the world's largest obstacle course that we're trying to bring to IU. So great opportunity to come back and, you know, get in there and play in it and whatnot. But it plays off the idea that, of course, stigma is the foremost obstacle to receiving treatment for mental health, as indicated by the 1999 Surgeon General's report. So outside of club details there, we talk about the College Toolbox project, and the whole bottom line with the national rollout is that in order to become an official chapter, an official part of the You Bring Change to Mind network at another university, there's some key steps that you have to complete. So there's really 4 key stages, and that all starts with an initial interest form where submitted by a student. After that is submitted, we invite you to a webinar just to provide more details about what this whole program is about and what they're getting themselves into as well. Then after that, they submit a more detailed interest form, and that really completes the first phase there. After that, they are sent a launch kit, and the materials in this launch kit are just going to help them meet 3 key milestones that we have for them before they can move on to the next phase. Those milestones are: 1, they need to find a mentor. That's going to serve as really their advisor and help them through the process of bringing this club on campus and carrying out throughout the year. And that's going to provide, we want them to really have a home for this organization to sit in. So ours is the Sociology department. We get additional resources and support by being partnering with them as well. And from there, the second thing they need to do is register as an official university organization. And lastly, we just want to see that they talked up about the organization, spread the word to other students. So we just want them to photograph 10 to 20 students holding our whiteboard, which is part of the kit. And on there, we just want them to write why the fight against stigma is important, why they want to do this on their campus. From there, once they get that launch kit, they report back to us with those 3 key milestones. There's a workshop that we're going to hold on their campus. It's really a gauge to see how well they can plan an event. We're going to provide all the programming, but we just want them to have a venue and to have the advertising and everything done. And at that workshop, it's really going to serve as an orientation. We're going to have a basic education on what stigma is, so we're all on the same page. An opportunity to talk to the student leaders, gauge the climate of stigma on their campus, and really just start to develop that initial relationship with them. So after that workshop, after everything's said and done, they get this golden toolbox, the college toolbox, which really includes all the materials they need to have an official and functioning You Bring Change to Mind chapter. So with that includes our budgeting, our assessments, details of our events, all of those things. And now they're an official part of the network. And then lastly, this all really culminates in what we're calling the College Summit, which is an opportunity for leaders of existing chapters, new and launching chapters, these bridge people, so upper level administration, and of course our active chapters, to come together and discuss some of our successes, some of the things that maybe didn't work as well as we wanted them to, and really the best practices at reducing stigma overall. So that was really the main points I wanted to hit, so thank you so much, and look for Q&A.
Anxiety has affected me since really the beginning. I was dealing with this all by myself. I was totally isolated. Nobody knew.
Everybody loved Shelby. She was a straight-A student, but a year ago, my sister lost her life to suicide.
I know that my girlfriend struggled really hard with telling people she had this issue. She could hardly tell me. You know, it hurts me because I feel like a lot of my friends have struggled with not being able to admit that they're dealing with these issues.
Last school year, there were 4 teen suicides that happened in Palo Alto that really sent our entire community into a shock.
Share it.
Instagram.
Let's snap it.
I think that social media is a very powerful tool for spreading these issues in a way that's approachable and also really powerful. These personal stories can become almost anthems or just rallying points for other people who feel the same thing.
I did attempt suicide and I tried to end my life, but I bounced back. I'm really thankful that I saw that post because they might not think that they're helping me, but I really appreciated it so much.
Shelby, I guess, never really felt that comfortable coming out and saying to us, you know, I've been really sad. I think, you know, there's something I need to do here.
You know, if you take that step, take that initiative to reach out, you know, tell someone that you're struggling, it can make the biggest difference.
I'm starting the conversation. I'm posting about mental health.
I'm ending the stigma.
We're socializing hope.
I like that.
Me importa el futuro.
Together, we can bring change to mind.
I think ending stigma is the only way to start the conversation and have people feel comfortable enough they can talk about it, they can seek help.
Show us what you're doing to start the conversation and end the stigma.
Wow. So I think we've begun to get a sense of the power of these public service messages that our friends and colleagues at Bring Change might have produced. And I think that was wonderful following the presentation we just heard. I think I want to go back to college. It seems like it's a better place. I just want to remind everybody, in your packets are these beautiful plastic packages or envelopes, and they have the cards in them. So if you are developing questions for our panelists for the Q&A, please write them on the 3x5 card or whatever this dimension is. You can even circle the name of the panelist who you would like the question to be directed to. And once you've written your questions, just pass them to the end of your aisle and we'll collect them for the Q&A. So our final formal presentation is from a colleague a little closer to home. Bennett Leventhal is a professor of psychiatry just up the 5 at the University of California, San Francisco, our sister institution. He is a child psychiatrist and directs the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Training Program at UCSF and is an active clinician and researcher. And I think you'll be very interested in his presentation. A new way of clubbing for youth. Let's bring change to mind. Dr. Leventhal.
Thank you very much. Let's see if I can get this to move. First of all, George, you are awesome. George is... As I walked in here, I told him the worst thing in the world is giving a talk after a talented young person or a pet. And so now I'm stuck. I'll do my best to keep up with your standard. Huh? I'm working on that after this. Okay. So the problem that we're here to talk about today is stigma. And as you've been hearing all kinds of explanations, stigma is a mark or a disgrace or infamy of disgrace or infamy. That is something that makes people think that something else is terrible. And this notion of it being a stain or a mark on someone as an individual that is perceived from the outside or from the inside is incredibly powerful. It changes not just an individual's life, but it can change a community. It leads to discrimination. We know a great deal about that. It leads to bullying, the most common cause of violence in youth. It leads to shame and doubt to the person who is the object of stigma. And it leads to the most painful thing of all, social isolation. Something that is just indescribably awful. So what do we know? This is an important starting point. This is about you. This isn't about me. It's not about them on the screen. It's about you. We know that about 1/2, 48% of the population in the United States, that's 1 in 2 of you. Am I screwing up something here? Okay, let's see. George, you did better than me already. 48% of the population in the United States, 1 in 2 of us, will have a definable psychiatric illness at some point in their life. Doesn't mean it's persistent, but they will meet diagnostic criteria and be impaired in their functioning. But what's really crucial about this is 75% of these illnesses will begin before the end of adolescence, and 50% of them will begin in childhood. And that translates into about 1 in 5 children and adolescents at any point in time have a psychiatric illness they're struggling with. 1 in 5. So let's just back up for a minute. Look to each side of you. One of you is directly affected as an individual, and all of you will have a friend or family member who's involved. So this is about all of us. This isn't about them. And so when we think about the conversation, this becomes easier because it's about us, about all of us. Psychiatric illness is by far more common than any other medical condition facing youth. I mean, just think about it for a minute. About 15% of children will have, and adolescents will have an anxiety disorder. How does this compare to cancer? 0.01%. Diabetes, less than 1%. Asthma, about 2%. I mean, these are rare disorders compared to the kind of psychiatric illnesses that we talk about. Even autism, which we think of as very rare, is about 2 to 3% of the population. So these are common disorders that commonly affect our children and us, and they lead to high levels of disability if they're not treated. In fact, anxiety and mood disorders, according to the World Health Organization, are the leading cause of disability, and suicide, depending on which study you look at, is the 2nd or 3rd leading cause of death in youth in any given year. And there are many other common disorders that affect children. So we're talking about something that is common in the general population, but most common is because it starts in our youth. And if you remember Sutton's Law, Willie Sutton was the famous bank robber, and they asked him why he robbed banks, because he said that's where the money was. And why do we think about working with youth? Because that's where this starts. And if it begins here, that's not only where the illnesses begin, but the misunderstanding, the false impressions, and the stigma begins here as well. So what are the challenges? Well, the first of the challenges is ignorance about psychiatric disorders. And it's common amongst everyone. Individuals, you and me, families, they have ideas about what psychiatric disorder means. For example, in many communities, ethnic groups, if somebody has a psychiatric disorder in a family, it makes the other children unmarriable. No one wants to mate with them. Well, they may want to mate with them, they just may not want to marry them. It also affects communities, as Professor Wells showed so beautifully in his presentation, that how the community interprets and feels about these individuals is powerful. And by the way, there's a great deal of ignorance amongst professionals. I can't tell you how often I'll see a child in my clinic who the mom has said there's something wrong, there's something wrong, there's something wrong, and they've been to one pediatric visit after the next, and the pediatrician or the nurse practitioner or the family practitioner says, oh, don't worry, they'll grow out of it. And then all of you going, yeah. But it's also true in schools, it's also true in other environments. So not just the general populace, but the people who should know often don't know. And ignorance leads to stigma, it leads to fear, it leads to social isolation, and of course it leads to lack of care. And ignorance is a horrible thing. It leads to pain and suffering. And we know for children who have psychiatric illness in adolescence, there's an average of an 8 to 10 year gap between the onset of symptoms and treatment. 8 to 10 years. How many times can you say that? If we said that it was an 8-year gap between the onset of symptoms and treatment of cancer or diabetes or asthma, the world would be outraged. You'd be marching in the streets. But if it's anxiety or ADHD or depression, that in and of itself speaks to the stigma. And we know, unfortunately, that the later onset of treatment makes it much more difficult to succeed, but it most importantly leads to years of pain and suffering. So there are a few possible solutions. One is to decrease ignorance, increase knowledge about psychiatric disorders. You've seen the PSAs, you've heard what Dr. Wells does. And this is good for families, individuals, communities, and professionals, and we're all doing that. We can also increase access to care. If we let people know about the illnesses, then they're more likely to get care sooner. We can do screening much more effectively in communities. Again, Dr. Wells' model for sure, but others, looking at how do we provide people information, do questionnaires and things of that sort, and then have access to earlier evaluations and interventions. And most importantly, improve health and healthcare insurance coverage, because finances is a powerful limiter. And only for psychiatric illness do we have limits in care. We say, well, wait a minute, you only have 2 visits for your cancer, or 1 visit for your diabetes. And by the way, we don't actually provide insulin. You can have some other medicine, but you know, we're not going to do that. But for psychiatric illness, we don't provide stimulants or ADHD or what have you. It's completely unacceptable. And we can improve care through more research, and you're hearing about some of that today because each of our programs has a research component. But if we were going to think about where to start, again, back to Sutton's Law, we decided we wanted to start with the youth. And why with the youth? Well, there are 2 reasons. Number 1, they're affected. And number 2, and very importantly, they don't have as well-formed biases and preconceived notions about things. In fact, they're in a life of learning. They're in school. And so they're focused on learning, and we think we have a better chance of working with them. So that led to Let's End the Stigma. And the idea was to increase knowledge about psychiatric illness, decrease social isolation, and increase social acceptance. So let's see how we did with that. First of all, actually, Let's, in and of itself, was created by a very interesting character named Phil Fontalea. Phil ran a mental health pharmacy in Los Angeles and noticed that a number of his patients just were struggling with stigma. And with a team of volunteers and staff, they tried to create this program of using clubs. And Phil knew that just doing it by himself wasn't going to work. And he drafted Steve Hinshaw, a psychologist, a very distinguished psychologist at Berkeley, and me, to help him assess the program and try to put things together. And for a variety of reasons, it got very complex, and Let's merged with Bring Change to Mind in 2014. And through a great deal of extraordinary effort on the part of Bring Change to Mind and Glenn Close and the board, they've really helped reorganize and revitalize Let's. And so in the process, really many of the things that George talked about, those same processes now work with a little bit more supervision for children and adolescents for us to create school-based clubs. And so we've developed resource guides and online materials and an evaluation plan that will ultimately involve 100 schools in Northern and Southern California in 2018. What's the impetus behind this? What's the reason that it's so important? Well, if you survey youth and ask them who do they talk to, one of the things that you find is that a large portion, nearly half, don't have anyone to talk to or won't talk to about these problems, and the rest, or it turns out 3/4, it's either they don't have anybody or it's their friends. That's where they turn for help. They don't turn to professionals, they don't turn to their teachers, they don't turn to their family. It's primarily to their friends or nobody. So how do we begin to shape that? How do we begin to change that? How do we help them have reliable sources of information? And the model that we've chosen is to use a peer-based approach. Help the peers help them. Just like Bernice and George have done at the college level, we're doing the same thing at the school level. But how do we do that? It's different. So we have helped these kids create clubs. So in schools, we have Let's clubs, just like you have a chess club and a music club and a whatever club you want to have, they organize clubs. And that's the model that works for them. Not the model that works for me, it's the model that works for them. And they become very enthusiastic about it. The way the clubs work is they choose a safe and familiar setting, and for them, the most familiar setting to do this sort of thing is school, not at home, not out in the community, but really where they hang out together. And they choose their optimal teachers, which is peers. And then they choose the optimal learning strategy, and that's modeling and active learning. By active learning, that means doing stuff. Kids just sitting around talking about things isn't enough for them. And so they have events, just like you saw with You Bring Change to Mind. So Let's Bring Change to Mind is a school-based club, just like any other club. It's student-led, but we have to have a lot more supervision because of the age. So they have a sponsor, just like everybody else does. They have to be approved by the school and all of that. But the membership is open to all students who are interested in learning about psychiatric illness, reducing stigma, and working together. It is not a club for children and adolescents who have psychiatric illness. It's a club for everybody, and everybody belongs who wants to. And in many schools, it's an incredibly diverse population. And they have organized activities, many of which are educationally oriented. That is, they have classes and give talks that are important. But most importantly, they're active, and they create programs, whether it's Stigma Sucks or they can't wrap buses, but they do other kinds of, they have ice cream parties and things of that sort. So that, and each school is different. Each community is different. It's culturally different. And they each try to establish their own identity. Bring Change to Mind headquarters provides for the school, the kids, all the club resources that they need. A guidebook, it tells them things that they can do, but it doesn't tell them things they have to do. The first mistake you make with kids is telling them what they have to do, and then the answer will be no. And then we provide support for their sponsors and the ever-present swag, which having stuff is good. We give them money so that they can get their club started, so fundraising isn't a barrier, but then they start raising their own money. And we provide a newsletter and an app that they can go to get things. And just like in the college program, we have an annual summit. And then we evaluate the program. And does Let's work? Well, let's see what our data tell us. We now can show, at least the initial pilot study, that we have the desired changes. We are decreasing ignorance by increasing knowledge about psychiatric disorders. We're changing the attitudes about the disorders, both at the level of the disorder, but also individuals affected. And we have a positive social outcome. And one of the things that Bernice talked about earlier, and George has talked about, and Ken talked about, is this whole issue of social distance. And if you look at the outcomes, one of the things that's most powerful is the attitudes change, but social distance changes as well. People become closer. And as you become closer, the need to be afraid or distance yourself because of some kind of misunderstanding disappears. And we have been able to show that this effect works. It's modest, but with a larger study, we think we'll have better outcomes. So our kids are busy. They do just like at IU, they have all manner of clubs. We don't have Richard, but the idea is basically the same. And then the annual summit which is really important when the kids get together. The adults who are involved in the annual summit actually have to behave like the kids, which is very difficult for us, but it's very important for them. And that's what really brings the community together, because all of a sudden it's not just about kids being kids, it's about kids being able to work with adults in a way that becomes very productive. So thank you very much. Now I'm so scared.
So maybe we'll start with a question for Dr. Leventhal. And this has to do with the question of early recognition. You made some comments about the prevalence of these disorders in childhood. Can you sort of say a few words about how you identify kids at risk early on, either at risk or kids who are developing symptoms?
Sure. So there are actually standard measures that we can use for screening. So during regular pediatric or family medicine visits, there are some standard questionnaires that we can use to ask families to have them fill out, and then they're scoreable, and they tell us whether a child has the symptoms or the risk for a particular disorder that then points us in the direction of doing a more detailed evaluation. But I think there's another part of this that when I teach the medical students, I say, and I'll be interested to hear my colleagues about this, if a mom comes in to me and says, there's something wrong with my child, and they're right until proven otherwise. And if a grandma comes in and says, there's something wrong with my grandchild, they're always right. And you know, I'm being a bit facetious about it, but really not. You have to take this seriously. And what happens is we live in a system where, in a society where the healthcare system is rush, 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 get through. You have 4 minutes for a pediatric visit or 6 minutes for a pediatric visit. And when someone answers yes to a question, it really creates a problem. And we have to, as clinicians, but as family members and people who own companies or are responsible for healthcare plans, be able to say, whoa, when we have a positive, we have to stop and explore it. And if we explore it, we, you know, most of the time we'll find something. Many times we won't, and that's great news. But if we find it, that's great news too. So standard assessment, but then taking parents' reports very seriously.
So I think this next question was addressed by its author to anyone from Bring Change to Mind. But I think, so maybe we could start with George or Pescosolido. And the question is, can you comment on the question or the connection between mental illness and substance abuse in teens? It seems like there's less stigma regarding substance abuse than about mental illness. However, well, anyway, let's go with that.
George points to me. Okay. Actually, in the American population, the public is much more stigmatizing of people with alcohol problems or with drug abuse problems than they are even with schizophrenia. So I think that in teens, among teens, there's a differential norm that kids are going to drink or maybe they're going to try drugs. But in terms of the societal reaction, I think it's the opposite. And I think in college, there is this idea that, they're going to explore different things as well. I mean, it's kind of trickled down to lower ages now. And I think that's one of the reasons why you don't have recognition, because you don't know, who is the student who is going to, try drugs or use alcohol and then find it as their major coping mechanism, or have the biological reactions that's going to make them addicted. And so I think students tend not to see each other as having these problems. And that's one of the things that the peer work at IU and I think other places are trying to do. University of Michigan has a Wolverines group that does the same thing. It's peer-to-peer attached to the health center. What's unique is really the Bring Change to Mind notion of, going with the larger culture as well. So yeah, I think that those affected at those ages may normalize, but the American population is quite harsh on those issues.
Thanks very much. So the next one, I'll start with a quick story. I just love this question. It inspired me. So when I was a medical student deciding what specialty to go into, and I declared my interest in psychiatry, and perhaps some of the other physicians in the room will relate to what I'm saying, what I heard from some of my most esteemed professors was, oh, Tom, you were so talented, you had so much potential. Why would you waste a career in psychiatry? So that's the build-up to of course, they ceased to be my esteemed mentors at that point. The question is, how do we cope, and I'm going to actually ask Dr. Wells to start in responding, how do we cope with the stigma associated with being part of a group that is attempting to reduce stigma? Isn't that a great question? So both the professionals, but I think the students and the lay participants. Dr. Wells, to you.
Oh, well, while you were telling your story, yes, I was thinking of my story, which is, as I went off to medical school, my parents said to me, good luck, you can be anything you want to be except a psychiatrist. But
Can I add to that before Ken goes on to his erudite answer on the technical question? There's courtesy stigma, right, which is what this question is about. And when I was at the National Institute of Heart, Lung, and Blood, because they were interested in my network model of how people get into services, I said something about, well, I don't know exactly how people in cardiology do this, but in psychiatry, the cardiologist leans over to me and says, psychiatry? That's hardly medicine. So even courtesy stigma exists at the NIH. Yeah, it was kind of an ouch moment.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I actually took this, knowing my parents as I did, as a challenge to go into psychiatry. My half full kind of psychology. So I saw a tremendous need in this area to do mind-changing things if you can. So how do we deal with that? I think everyone needs to be an advocate in a sense for the kind of care that's needed, for the dignity that every patient deserves. I think when you go to such common language, it can really help. Other physicians will get it, but it's something that we all have to be alert to. I think when we're family members as physicians and dealing with other family members or friends and start seeing prejudicial behaviors in care, you go for the jugular. I mean, this is how it has to be. This is not a technical answer. This is a personal answer. And let's hope that by starting early, what I really like about the programs that you all talked about today is getting more of a culture change going. And the only thing I was going to ask about that is how is it going with populations that maybe don't have the same resources, right? With populations that don't have the same resources for these programs, right? I mean, these are students in college as opposed to not in college. So, I mean, there's a need for this more generally. Maybe earlier programs in high schools and so on, we have more of a full population. But are these programs reaching into the inner city and in places, where stigma is needed?
George, do you want to speak to this at all in terms of what you might encounter leading student groups on campus?
I do. I do think this is a problem, even for us at college, in that getting people that aren't extremely passionate about the surrounding issues as some of our leaders may be, getting them to participate in the club about stigma. It's kind of like, oh, I don't really know if I want to touch that. And I think the solution to that is just to continue to normalize the conversation and get people talking about this in activities and venues that aren't so educational, if you will, so it doesn't feel like we're lecturing at them, but we're interacting and then we're just having, like I said, a normal conversation to talk about these issues.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think the other thing about this is really the notion of the optimal time. And this is a great time to be doing this. And I say that, again, as a personal story based on teaching for 30 years and doing this Medicine in America course, when I got to the mental health part, and, I would talk about the big three and then talk about labeling theory, whatever. Students would come up to me afterwards when I first started teaching and they would go, my mother has depression. All right, now I have to sort of warn them, because what they do now, sort of like hold on, because they'll start jumping up. I was on Ritalin in high school. This generation is very open. It's a really good time. This is, I'm very keyed into the notion of when the timing is right. And it's right not only because the students are more open about it, some of them are very mad about what happened to them in K through 12, but also the administrators are just, I've not seen this before in my 30 years of teaching. So the timing is really essential here. And, we want to base it on science. That's our tension, as Bennett talked about. We want to base it on science, and yet we know that we're riding a wave here that we don't want to miss.
And Bennett, I think you had a comment as well.
Yeah, so I think, and when is the time to follow on the timing is right? What's the timing right for you? It's actually not right now. You're in a lecture hall now. The timing right for you is at dinner tonight. You go home at your dinner table and sit down and talk about what we talked about today. And you normalize it with your kids and with your neighbors and your friends. And you may talk about your own illness, just like you talk about believe me, if you can talk about inflammatory bowel disease or other bowel-related problems, or if the former vice president can talk about erectile dysfunction, you can talk about psychiatric illness. Believe me, it's okay. But you need to talk about it as an illness. You don't have erectile issues. You have erectile dysfunction. You don't have cancer issues. You have cancer or heart disease. These are illnesses, and talk about them as illness, not issues, not problems. And we need to think about when events occur. For example, someone dies from a psychiatric illness. They didn't kill themselves. Depression killed them. And stop talking about it as, let's start talking about how this is a lethal illness. And when we talk about it as a lethal illness, then it's imperative that we have treatment. And so the conversation can take place at your dinner table, on the couch in the living room, at a cocktail party. It's okay. And if you can carry that conversation forward today, not tomorrow, today, then the timing will be good for the people who are going to hear it.
So the next couple of questions I think are related, and I'm going to throw it open to all the panelists. And it opens, or the first part is, how do you advocate for a person who needs help without outing them? The outing is in quotes. And as a related matter, how do students and individuals address, even if they're open themselves, how do they address, that is open to evaluation treatment, how do you address parental or familial resistance to the idea that their son or daughter, or student at college or in high school, might need help? Anybody?
Well, I'd say there's no better case than looking at Virginia Tech. That is one of the few school shootings that in fact was directly related to families not understanding the problem, professors not knowing what to do or being very harsh in response. And so, I think it's really important that, we sort of think about these issues of how one discloses or how you suggest. And I think, again, if we just become, I think that I think the Brits have really got a good thing on this, that they were, I don't know how many of you know about the British Time to Change program, but they used the money from the lottery, which was about 18 million pounds, to start a national effort. I won't call it a campaign, one, because I don't like the military implications, but as Bennett said, we don't force people because then they react like this. But the other idea is it's been a long time now that they've been doing this, and they showed very small changes to start, and people were like, oh, But the point is that societies don't change quickly. They just don't. And if we're not in there for the long haul, it's not going to happen. So I think that when we think about these issues of how you disclose and how you think about talking to people about it, we have to do some things that maybe sometimes people don't like. Consumers don't like, or although we always want their voice there, but in terms of getting to outside the choir, you have to get their attention because they're the people who say, it's not me, it's not my family, this is not my issue. And we know it is. And so that's why, why we talk about bait and flip, right? Which is close to bait and switch, which is illegal, right? We talk about it more in terms of, house flipping ideas, because we're trying to, bring in those people who need to, or we would like them to realize that this is sort of an everyday issue and to normalize it. But I don't know, Bennett, or Ken, or if anybody wants to talk about the issue of disclosure, because I think that's really important, this idea of who outs whom, or, but the Brits are doing, they just go around, they've sort of tried to have this campaign, or part of an effort to just say, you okay? So as a society, if we're just more attuned to whether or not people are doing all right, and not saying, are you depressed? I mean, there's a very loaded difference between those two.
Okay, so the first thing was the importance of information and providers making sure that there's actual real information and we take the time to educate people and talk to families. The second point really is on the framing issue that Bernice referred to. One of the things that the UK and many other nations do is they do have more of a framing and actual track emotional well-being. And I see actually 3 of the leads from the fellows, Enrico and Sophie and Jared's over there, for a program we've been working on with the Surgeon General, the former Surgeon General, unfortunately, around a national effort to frame emotional well-being and to have programs be, a strength-based framing. It doesn't mean mental illness is not important, but if you can get a hook around variation in mental wellness and emotional well-being, and sometimes you're not as high as you would like, and so forth. So that's what Australia, the UK, others have been doing, and we have not been, really tracking emotional well-being. So add that to your stigma survey.
Okay. Send me the item you want on it.
Yeah. Anyway, so you can talk to my fellows here, because they have a whole 150-page report that they did for the Surgeon General.
Do they have 2 questions?
Yes.
Okay.
The answer is
Just
yes.
tell me, whoever you are.
Okay. Bennett, did you want to respond to this one?
I think the other thing is that there are a lot of highfalutin and fancy ways to do it, but if you have a friend who's depressed or a family member's depressed and you don't know how to talk about it, ask them, how do I talk about this? It makes me uncomfortable. I want to help. I want to be able to think about it. I want to be able to, I just don't know. I mean, what's wrong with saying I'm ignorant? And you could be my very best teacher. You're my very best friend. You're my best wife. You're my, if you've had more than one, you could have a, if not, you still have a best wife or a best husband. But to say, teach me and let me help, rather than be quiet. And I think we know from plenty of research that if you talk about it, it's always better. It doesn't make it worse. I know you're hearing voices. Tell me about them. How can I help you? It always makes it better when you're not alone.
Thanks. So the next one is partly statement and partly question. And it's linked to a second question. The statement is, it's great to have programs at universities and high schools, but especially with social media, we have children in 1st to 3rd grade sexting and bullying, and 5th graders attempting suicide. So the statement is it needs to start earlier. Might we have hope that some of the successes on college campuses and in high schools might lead to grade school and earlier intervention?
Yeah, absolutely. We're already thinking about how to move this downward into grade schools, into, and yes, to start with younger children and to think of this as a continuum in education. Remember, this is a developmental process, and development begins when it begins. And so the earlier we can intervene, the better off we'll be. But I think we tried to start, in both cases, in naturalistic framework, where there was a framework that you could slide into. To start doing this in lower grades is going to be a little bit bigger challenge, but with the data we have now, I think we'll be able to do that.
Terrific.
And I can add to that inspired by Leanne and Let's, the Let's students were saying that the biggest challenge for them was as they were graduating from high school, there was no, they were going to colleges and universities, didn't have anything. So based on that, we applied for and received a grant from the IU Women's Philanthropy Council to use IU again as the pilot for the connector from high school, so a transition process from high school to college. And the reason why IU is a good site is because we have 2 large high schools, and many of those students come to IU. So, if you just picked any high school, students go everywhere, and our students in Bloomington South and North do go everywhere, but a substantial enough proportion go right to IU so that we can start the Let's Clubs in the fall and then start the transition process. And so that we can begin to build at least that model. I'll leave the younger students, the younger kids to Bennett because I'm not a practitioner, and that's the first thing I say because I'm director of the Indiana Consortium for Mental Health Services Research, and I have students come in every day with mental health problems and ask me questions, and the first thing I say is, I'm not a clinician, and they'll say like, well, I'm doing so well here at IU, and I've been on Ritalin, I'm thinking of going off. And the first thing I say is, does it ever occur to you that maybe you're doing well because you're still on it? But certainly that's a question for the person who's prescribed the medication, not me. And so, and you need to talk to your parents about it too. So I think all of these things, they do, integrate. And I do believe that if you start with very young children, they will normalize it in a way. And again, that they'll grow up. Maybe it's not as fast social change as we want, but I think it will be a deeper social change.
I think one of the things you've learned from all of our presentations is that these are systems level interventions that work far better than individual. So for example, in bullying, the bullying research is quite clear. If you just try to intervene with the bully, you actually won't solve the problem of bullying. You have to take an entire school, the entire environment, and shift it. It's actually remarkably easy to do, relatively speaking, and it's remarkably economical compared to other intensive therapeutic interventions, and you can make changes very substantially. So each one of the interventions we've talked about are environmental, and I think thinking about how to change the environments in which you live is really where the differences are going to come.
Bennett, somehow you knew that there was a bullying question. Thank you for knowing and for beginning to address it. So, I think this, again, is for anyone who might respond among our panel. What types of stigma are addressed on the campuses besides depression? We've heard a lot about depression. Does it include stigma, for example, regarding people with physical or developmental disabilities, such as those who have Down syndrome or autism, or invisible disabilities like fetal alcohol syndrome or the spectrum disorder associated with it, or for that matter, and Ken, you might want to speak to this part, cultural or racial stigma?
Okay, well, on the college, we're not a depression-oriented group. I mean, it's all, any and all. And one of the things that we're doing is we're working very heavily with the multicultural organizations at the administrative level to try to figure out the specific needs for different groups. And so there are activities going on. So there's the multicultural centers have these Let's Talk groups that are starting to address how students of color experience these problems and how they get differential responses from faculty and other students. And so those things are, I think those things are going on. So one of the things I was trying to say in my presentation was that really the notion of what makes you feel different is also what makes you unique. But there is a correlation between experiencing prejudice in other areas and having that lead to more stressful situations, whether or not it ends up being a psychiatric illness. So I don't think you can exclude those things. But one of the things we know about teenagers and emerging adults is there's always something that makes them feel less than, right? It's not necessarily, just, I don't want to say just is not the right word, but it's not a status characteristic like, their race or whether they come from a rural town in Indiana. Sometimes there are things that we don't even consider. So we try to do the whole thing as an opening to the community as an issue of difference. What makes you feel different? And then, sort of embracing that and seeing that as something that makes you unique. So we're not depression oriented. We don't exclude it, but we don't focus on it. I don't know, George, if you want to say that.
Oh, so I'll add to that. With our discussions, our activities, our topics, we do try to focus on a broad spectrum of everything, really just to start talking about it, just knowing that you're in an environment where we can have a discussion with individuals that care to hear what you have to say, care to hear about your experience, regardless of whether it's depression or anxiety or any of the things listed.
I was just going to say that I think it's also important to have ongoing ways of sharing what you're learning so that people can be informed by the findings of, the outcomes, whether it's the personal stories or the outcomes. So, for example, we did a sort of similar project, not so much in communities, but in primary care with ethnically diverse populations, and found that kids who actually did get care did even once early, did much better for an extended period of time. For adults, we actually found that one opportunity of getting good care for depression led to 10 years of better outcomes. And for minorities, the equivalent to removing 6 to 12 deaths of a loved one over 10 years in terms of the emotional burden. So I think finding ways of sharing those stories can be one way of overcoming people's reluctance to care. Again, information can be valuable, but then it's not just telling people that. It's how do you have the connection and the exchange so that people can, take it in their own language.
And there are so many things out there that you can draw from. So one of the things that we did this year that wasn't specifically related to You Bring Change to Mind, but when we found out about it, we participated, was we did, there was a moth this year. And so, the group came out, the production company came out. Many of the stories were about these kinds of issues. And it was really impressive.
But I think another thing to consider is to seize opportunities when they arise naturally. And children and adolescents, because by their very nature, A, can't keep their mouths shut, and B, don't keep secrets very well. When they give you an opening, you have to seize it. So I'll tell you, I was practicing when I in a relatively small community, and I had this is in Chicago, but it was a neighborhood in Chicago, and I had a group of patients at a particular school, and they started having lunch together and formed a group called the Levies. And then within a very short order, the 5 or 6 of them would sit together, and then there were 10 or 12 kids around them, and then 15 kids around them, and it became one of the major lunchtime activities at this school, and they were talking about what medicines they were taking, what symptoms they were having, what I was telling them to tell their parents, and so on. But what it did is it opened a discussion that actually then we went in and they started providing educational support, and the counselors got involved in. But it started with the kids. It didn't begin with it. I mean, I didn't tell them to have lunch together, and I wish I had been clever enough to do that. They're actually quite clever. So when you find resources, or you're driving your kids in the car, your grandchildren in the car, and they're sitting in the back and they're talking about something, join the conversation. Don't let it go by itself. And when there's misinformation, try to correct it, but don't correct it by preaching, but ask them to tell you why they think the way they think. Then think of ways to continue that conversation. You'll find so many opportunities to do that it can really change not just their lives, but yours as well.
I'll bet the levies also kept you honest. Perhaps the group gave you some feedback about yourself that no individual would have, right?
It's true.
Just a quick reminder to everybody, also in your packet is this 8.5 by 11 summary sheet where this is for you to give us, this is a survey. We'd love your feedback, just to remind you, because I know not everybody can stay until 11. So the next couple of questions are kind of related, really it goes to some of our core beliefs about the etiology or causes of some of these disorders. So the question, part A, what should the messaging be for changing people's perceptions and attitudes of mental illness? For example, illness like cancer or heart disease versus character flaw. And the second half, straight to the heart of the professionals. Mental health providers also can stigmatize mental illness, not just ignorance, but, for example, people with personality disorders like borderline personality disorder or substance use frequently can get very negative, stigmatizing, judgmental vibes from mental health professionals. So, how as providers can we address this among our colleagues and among our trainees, and I would say among ourselves?
I think the importance of discussing it as an illness is very, very key, because I know several individuals through different tabling activities we've done that have come up to me and said, you know, wow, my parents really don't understand like the depression, like there's actually something wrong. I'm not just really sad or like anxiety. I don't just get really nervous. They don't understand that this is an actual illness that can be treated, that needs to be treated, not just something that you hope goes away or you wait for it to go away. How they can get technical.
Anybody else
Well,
want to speak to that?
I just don't think we should goose step to any particular message. I think the messages have to vary. So, for example, for college students or younger kids, you know, the message that it's really an illness is important. But the way that that Glenn got in touch with me was reading an article that we did in American Journal of Psychiatry that showed that Americans get it with regard to a disease like any other. Whether or not they believe it in their heart of hearts may be another question. But if you ask them about all of those standard, what we call attributions, you know, the rates are like 80% of Americans say that they think that this is really an illness, that it has a genetic cause, et cetera. But there are two things that are important about that. One, the research also shows that this is not related to whether or not they stigmatize. So the disease like any other tagline, for adults anyway, has taken us as far as it's going to take us. And it's really not going to make that much of a push. The second thing is that there have been studies by my colleagues at Columbia that show that when people endorse genetic background, genetic causes, there's a backlash effect, that they're more stigmatizing, especially as people get older, saying, well, I really don't want my son or daughter marrying somebody who has depression because I don't want my grandchildren, right, to have it. So I think that we have to think about different kinds of messages. And, you know, I said earlier that sometimes the messages, you know, that's a message that we need for certain age groups, but it's also a message that's very kind of safe and whatever. We did a PSA that I particularly love that we borrowed from the Brits with permission that you can look at online, and it's called Schizo. And it starts with a typical opening that looks like it's going to be a horror movie, right? Because one of the standard associations in America between schizophrenia, can I have that? Why don't you give me that?
Here, give her this one.
Do you want to take it off?
Turn that off, turn it off.
Okay, one of the standard associations we have in America is the homicidal maniac, right? Which we see portrayed in films and things.
Don't forget the axe murderer psychiatrist.
Oh yeah, that's true. And so, so this starts with that, and it then shifts to Glenn and her family. And Kaylin saying that, you know, I'm sorry if you were expecting a homicidal maniac, but in fact, people like me suffer from that kind of stigma every day. Now, we've had different reactions to that, okay? The first reaction we've had is that it is the single PSA that has had the most effect of any of the PSAs that we have tested, okay? Because it brings in the people outside the choir. It captures their attention and then it flips them, right? So it's bait and flip all over again. But the second thing is that we've had negative reactions from consumers. You are stigmatizing us. Well, you know, if you believe the science, no, we're actually helping. So I don't think there's any standard message that's going to work right now. And the message has to be tailored, I think, to a certain extent to age groups, to communities of color, to men versus women. That's why I think the Stronger Than Stigma is such a powerful messaging thing. And, you know, where I've come as a scientist on this is like, anybody who throws anything at stigma, I'm happy that they're doing it, right? I would like them to be scientifically tested so that we know that we're not wasting our money. But I really believe that as more and more efforts are made, it will have a larger culture-wide effect. So I worry less about what the messaging is, as long as it's not incredibly stigmatizing, because some things do. And the people at SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Organization, would not talk to me for 2 years because we evaluated their 3 PSAs in What a Difference a Friend Makes campaign, and you can find those as well. And one of them was extremely powerful. It was called the Friendster video. They had another one that was on 2 guys, younger guys, talking during a video, playing video games, and that turned out to be effective for younger children, but older emerging adults found it to be insulting. And then they had one called The Door, and that actually was stigmatizing. And that's why they didn't talk to me for 2 years, but they didn't do their homework. And so I think that that's why I work with Glenn's organization, because, we have a sense that when we put something out, it's not that we're not going to have backlash, maybe, but we know that it has an effect in the direction that we want. And so, I think there are many messages out there, and I think they should come in part from the grassroots. What in your community might change? And then let's see if that's really what the community thinks, not just a person, and then let's do it.
Thank you, Bernice. Bennett, do you want to say a word as somebody who trains young psychiatrists about this?
Yes, I think that, I hate to admit it, but we're human. And we have the foibles of other humans. We have biases. We learn things that are just mistaken, and we have habits that are often not terribly helpful. And so I think we have to be very aware for all, obviously you're the choir, you're here today and you're sympathetic to this cause, but even we will make mistakes and say things that we regret. And I think we have to be vigilant about it, first of all, but second of all, to start thinking about changing our vocabulary. So for example, I think the word crazy needs to go out of our vocabulary. We have to stop saying crazy. Now, do I do it occasionally? Yeah, and then do I have to stop and say, whoa? But it's like many other offensive terms, or maniac, or retard. We just have to really be sensitive to that. And when personality disorders, when we're training our trainees, very well too, Tom, that we have to, they're not really treatable. Yes, of course they are. But they're not really good patients. That's what gets said by the trainees. They're not really good patients. They're good people who need our help. But I think we have to be very sensitive to it. And when we make the mistake, as we often do, we have to correct ourselves. In the case when we're with somebody, even apologize. But we have to set the standard and say we're just not going to use words like that, because it conveys an attitude that we have to address. But we all have biases, and we have to be attentive to them.
Thank you. Well, the question that I thought might come in came in, and we have about 5 minutes, so this might be our last one. It was addressed to Dr. Wells, and we can open it up. Can you comment or advise on teens watching the 13 Reasons Why series?
There is a whole literature on the contagion that can happen around suicide, especially in teens, and how to approach intervening around the media. You're probably quite aware of that, Bernice and Bennett, so you can comment more specifically on that. I don't know the particular show that you're commenting on, but how you get the word out on the one hand, because you really do want to get the word out and raise awareness and have people without stimulating the contagion, which, anyway, so.
Okay, everybody gets a minute, so everything you know in a minute, even greater challenge.
Okay, everything I know in a minute. Okay, well, it's a teaching moment. I'm not sure I'm opposed to it being there. I think that, again, there's lots of suicidal ideation among teens, and so this is an opportunity to talk about it, and the depiction of her suicide is actually quite brutal and maybe a realistic kind of wake-up call for kids who are thinking about it. But there is a contagion effect. It affects timing of attempts. It doesn't necessarily affect whether or not they will do it, but it does affect timing.
Bennett, as the child psychiatrist, do you want an opportunity here?
Well, you know, I think it's just like saying hey, this medicine is good for everybody. And some kids have actually responded very nicely to it. It's provoked very interesting and productive discussions. And for some children, it's been very disturbing. And for some adults, it's been very disturbing. And for some adults, it's given them a venue for which to have a conversation with their teens. For the latter, it's great. For the former, we need to do something else. So to think of one thing as a panacea or the solution is naive. It's a very complicated issue, and it's out there, so we have to contend with it. I think the best way to contend with it is ask the teens who are around you what their reaction is and how it makes them feel, and then to carry on the conversation from there.
I think the first thing you have to do is you have to know if your kid is watching it, right? Because if they're watching it in isolation, that's the most dangerous situation.
Mm-hmm. Or they're not watching it and they hear from a friend who's interpreted it,
right.
And you don't know what the interpretation is, so you have to correct.
Last comment, Dr. Wells.
I was just going to say, I think in general, one of the things we have not done as well is the early intervention prevention aspect of the agenda. I mean, it's come up in other ways that we're talking today. So I would really hope as a field, I mean, if this were, again, heart disease or diabetes, you know, no one would be saying you shouldn't figure out how you can effectively intervene before something bad happens. But so I hope as a field that we can convince our funders, our federal agencies that we need to not only track stigma, but to figure out how we can beat stigma and get there earlier with effective intervention and appropriate messaging.
So we've just gotten started, but we need to stop. I want to thank all of you for attending. Again, ask you to please fill out the survey as you exit. Again, a huge thanks to the Resnick Board and Bring Change to Mind. Thank you very much. And to all of you for being here.